Good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday. I'm glad to see you all this morning. It's a bit chilly outside. I'm glad you made it in here safely, and it's like slightly warmer. I know I've had a few people tell me it's not warm enough, but up here in front of the lights, it's warm enough. And so very glad to see you all this morning. I missed you all last week. Thank you to Andrew for filling in for me with Dinah. Today we're going to be looking at Tamar. And the story of Tamar is dynamic, to say the least. And so I'm really excited to be here with you to do that. A reminder that we have all of our old sessions on our website, stmichael.org/RBS. And we encourage you to share your questions throughout the week. If you're here live, ask them now. If you're watching online later, then put them in the comment section and we'll go back and check. And then hopefully we can get to your questions week on week so that we can keep this whole Women in the Bible series going strong. Let's open with a prayer and we'll jump in. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, as the season changes, we ask that you be with us today. Be with us in our gratitude that we have the opportunity, the privilege, to come together and to study your word and to help it to inspire us to use our gifts in the world. Today, as we come to you with our hearts and minds, we ask that you lift up those that we hold close, those who need your help, those who need your healing touch, those who may feel alone, those who may feel unloved. We ask that our prayers and your presence help to give them strength and to lift them up. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, gang. Well, the story of Tamar is explicit. I hope that you have read ahead. It's chapter 38. It's not a huge chapter, but the story resonates a lot in our tradition. And I think it's important for us to know the story and then to actually take some time to reflect on why this story might actually matter to us. So we're going to start by just discussing the story structure as we do each week. And then we're going to look at the story in three parts. First, we're going to look at Tamar's marriage and her widowhood. Then we're going to look at how she takes control of her narrative once things don't go quite as she would expect. And then third, we're going to look at her pregnancy and how her lineage impacts us over time, all the way through to today. First, we're going to talk about where this story falls in the grand arc of Genesis. So as I noted, this is Genesis chapter 38. That's Tamar's story. But there is a bigger story that is kind of sandwiched around this story, and that is the story of Joseph. We had a question this past week to clarify something someone thought they heard me say, which was that Joseph could have been the line through which Jesus came, like David and then Jesus. If I said that, I should not have. I don't think I said that. But I want to just clarify that Judah is where the line goes to David and then to Jesus. So Judah as one of Joseph's brothers. But Joseph figures in a very interesting way. And so we're going to talk about Joseph's story just at the very beginning because it's important to put the story of Tamar into context within the story of Joseph, which is both before and after the story of Tamar. So if we look at chapter 37, that really begins the story of Joseph. And if any of you have been in Bible study with me for long enough, you know I love the story of Joseph. It's so good. And so essentially what we get is the beginning of Joseph's story in chapter 37. Joseph is the 11th son of Jacob, the first son of Rachel, and Jacob loves Joseph. And Jacob favors Joseph. And because of Jacob's favor, his 10 older brothers cannot stand him. And not only does Jacob's favor make his older brothers not like him, but Joseph does not help himself. Joseph is such a twerp. And so he has these dreams, and then he tells everybody about his dreams, and he seems to have no clue that his dreams that essentially say that all of his brothers and his father are going to worship him at some point in the future might not be received well. And so Joseph gets this very pretty coat, and he's very favored, and all of his older brothers are out working, and his older brothers have just had enough of Joseph. And so Joseph comes out, And Joseph is seized by his brothers and put into a cistern and then ultimately sold into slavery, and he vanishes. Now, to put this into kind of historic context, it's been over 100 years since Sarah has died. And so you've got Sarah's death over a century earlier. Then, of course, we get Isaac and Rebekah. And then we have Jacob, and then Leah and Rachel and Bilhah and Zilpah. We've got all of that. And then, of course, the 12 sons. As Jacob fathers these 12 sons, they will ultimately become the 12 tribes of Israel. But a whole lot of stuff happens between the sons being born and them actually creating these tribes that will then create Israel as we know it in the kingdom period. As Joseph is seized by his brothers, we see Reuben, the oldest, try to save Joseph from whatever the brothers might do to him. But Judah plays a very interesting role in Joseph being sold off into slavery. And that's important because, of course, Tamar's story has a lot to do with Judah. And so in chapter 37, I'm just going to read a little portion of it. In chapter 37, starting at verse 25, we hear about the way that Judah actually impacts the story of Joseph, which will then come back at the end of the story with Tamar. Chapter 37, verse 25 says, "All the brothers sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin, and on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up out of the cistern, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. If we jump to verse 31, it says, "They took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They had the long robe with sleeves taken to their father, and they said, 'This we have found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not.' And he recognized it and said, 'It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph has no doubt been torn into pieces.' Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days." So I tell you that story, likely not new, because Judah has this key role to play. Earlier, Reuben said, let's not really mistreat Joseph, but Judah kind of comes alongside and says something that is odd, but I suppose makes sense. It's rational. Let's not just kill Joseph. Let's at least get some money for him. That's essentially what Judah says. And so the brothers are like, makes sense. And so they sell Joseph into slavery. They make some money off of him, and then they fool Jacob into thinking that Joseph's dead. Now, we know later on in Genesis, Joseph's going to come up as number 2 in Egypt and ultimately save the entire family. But that's all we hear of the story of Joseph before we pivot to chapter 38. And it's important because it could seem like chapter 38 is just inserted randomly in this larger story of Joseph. But what it really does is it actually raises up the line of Judah very intentionally and makes a connection between some of the wrong that Judah did against Joseph, some of the wrong that Judah does against Tamar, and then how God still uses Judah's line through Tamar for his good purposes long term. Now, we may understand Judah's line being used that ultimately brings us to Jesus. But of course, the Jewish story uses Judah's line to ultimately bring them to David. And so both lines matter. Whether your endpoint is David or your endpoint is Jesus, it all flows through Judah. Questions about that setup before we actually get into chapter 38. All right, so let's then talk about the basic arc of Tamar's story before we get into the details. Chapter 38 begins with Judah getting married and having 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. Those 3 sons then need a wife, or need wives. Judah finds a Canaanite woman to marry his oldest son, and her name is Tamar. Is apparently a wicked person, and so dies, is killed. And so then the Levirate marriage law comes into play, about what to do with the widow Tamar. So let's have a pause, and it's important for us to understand what the Levirate marriage law actually says. Levirate is a word that is anchored in the old Latin term lever, which essentially means husband's brother. And what this law says is that if a married man dies and has not produced an heir, then his surviving brother is now responsible to take his widow as his wife and to bear children with her for his dead brother. So put specifically, dies, so Judah says to Onan, you need to take Tamar as your wife and have children for your brother. Now that might seem a little odd to us, but let me put it into context around inheritance, because there is the idea that the oldest son is going to receive all of the inheritance is very important to understand based on what Onan then does. Because as the story goes, Onan starts to sleep with Tamar, but intentionally spills his seed on the ground in order for Tamar not to get pregnant. And why? Because if Onan has a child with Tamar, that child is not Onan's. That child is Er's. Because is the oldest son, would have gotten a double portion of the inheritance. So let's do a little math. There are 3 sons. The inheritance would have been split in 4 parts. Would have gotten half. Onan and Shelah would have each gotten a quarter. With out of the way, that inheritance is now split into thirds, and Onan would get 2/3, and Shelah would only get 1/3. Onan is incentivized to not actually have children for because if Onan had a son with Tamar, that would become Er's heir, and Onan would be back to only getting a quarter of the inheritance. So he would get half as much if he actually fathers a child with Tamar. Does that all make sense? So this law is meant to perpetuate a genetic line. And as we've discussed in here every single week, it is critically important to have children because children are essentially your insurance in life. They work the land, they have their own children, they build wealth, they protect you physically from anyone who may be an aggressor, and on and on. So Onan is supposed to have children, not only with Tamar, but with his own wife. But Onan does not. And his actions are deemed wicked, just like and he is also killed. And so Tamar is left widowed twice. And now Judah, in the arc of the story, begins to wonder if Tamar is the problem. And so Judah looks at Tamar like a little black widow or something, and he says, I'm not going to let her kill my 3rd son. And so he says to Tamar, go back to your father's house and wait until Shelah, the 3rd son, is old enough to actually fulfill the law to have children with you in Er's place. Tamar goes back and waits, and she waits until one day she finds out that Shelah is plenty old, enough to have married her and helped her to have children, and yet Judah has not given him to her. So Judah is holding Shelah back against the law, and then Tamar has to take matters into her own hands. Questions about that setup before we get into the details? It's good stuff. I mean, this is like the best soap opera you've ever seen. Whenever I teach the Old Testament to especially teenagers, I say, there is no reality show that you have ever seen that is as good as the stories in the Old Testament. These are the ones we don't read in church, but they are very good. Okay. Let's then get into the details of the story. We're going to talk about Tamar's marriage and actually look at the way that the writer tells this story. So at the beginning, we know that Judah picks a wife and has 3 sons, and then his wife is unnamed. Then he chooses Tamar to be Er's wife. Now, interesting note, Tamar is a Canaanite. And a Canaanite is not the same as an Israelite. The story writer is trying to emphasize Tamar being an outsider. Otherwise, there's no real reason to name her as a Canaanite. And it's important to note that Canaanites came from the line of Ham. Ham is one of Noah's sons, and Ham is the one who went in and saw Noah when he was naked and drunk. Do you remember the story? Another one we don't read in church. So Noah, we read the part of like the rainbow and the dove and the olive branch and all that's nice. What we don't read is that Noah got off the boat and got so drunk that he corralled around naked and basically passed out in his tent. Well, so Ham goes into the tent, sees him naked, and then runs out to tell his two brothers and make fun of his father. Well, the two brothers come in and cover their father in order to try and respect him. And because of what Ham did, he was cursed. And it's Ham's descendants that are the Canaanites. And so the Israelites are not really supposed to like the Canaanites. Later, hundreds of years later, when Joshua takes the Israelites into the promised land, the Canaanites are one of the groups that gets slaughtered. But here, Tamar is taken from the Canaanite population in order to marry the Israelite, Let's look at chapter 38, verse 6. Judah took a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law in her. Raise up offspring for your brother." But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went into his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up," for he feared that he too would die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. So as noted before, the Levirate marriage law says that the brothers are supposed to have children for their deceased brother. Well, now you've got two dead brothers. And interestingly, we rarely have God explained this way. So before you ask, why would God kill these guys? Remember, this is the storyteller talking about how God killed these men. What that typically means is that they died young. And so the story would go, something must have been wrong. It's sort of like if you were blind or lame, something's wrong with you, demon, possession, and evil. If you die too young, then there must be something wicked about you, which is why God had you killed. So that's the way the storyteller is telling the story. I have no idea what did. Obviously, Onan, not an upstanding person. And that's part of Tamar's story. So Tamar comes to presumably marry in a very respectable way. And yet that marriage ends without any children. Onan then comes along, and Onan is abusing and using Tamar for his own pleasure. The Levirate marriage law is not meant to be something that is abused. It's really meant to produce children. And yet Onan is essentially using Tamar for his own pleasure and making sure that Tamar does not actually get pregnant. This kind of action is obviously seen as wicked, and the storyteller means for us to understand that God's killing of Onan is, in a sense, just. And so now Onan is dead. But this leaves Tamar in a very, very vulnerable position, because not only is being a widow hard enough, being a widow twice over is even harder. And she's a Canaanite, which means she's actually not really part of the community. And so when Judah says, "Go back to your father," he doesn't mean like across the street. He means go back to the Canaanites, like kind of get out of here. And so Tamar follows instructions, does what she is supposed to do. She covers herself in a veil. She goes as a widow back to her father's house and waits patiently. Now, before we continue, let's actually take a look at the dynamism here of Judah. Judah is from the line of Abraham. And so Judah is the inheritor of Abraham's covenant with God. God does not sit passively by in this story as he often does in many other stories. There is this desire for God's justice from the jump. We are told that is wicked. We are told that Onan is wicked. In both cases, the storyteller is meant for us to understand their deaths as being righteous and just. We are being set up for what will happen later with Tamar to also be understood as Tamar seeking righteousness and justice for the way that she has been treated badly. Tamar, as an abused person, is not ignored by God. Instead, God will use her for his purposes and help her to ultimately get the justice that she deserves. So as she's sent back to her father's house, she waits in order to marry the third son, Shelah. Questions about that before we get to Tamar taking control? Yes, ma'am. How old is Tamar? Tamar could have been as young as 12 when she married I mean, when we think of a woman gets married when she starts menstruating, because that is then when she is able to bear children. And so in the same way that we look at, say, Mary, Jesus' mother, would have, 12, 13, 14, she would have been that young. So would Tamar. So at this point, if you imagine she gets married, she doesn't have any children, dies, Onan, there's at least a little bit of time there where she's not having any children. Minimum, she's probably 17 at this point. But it doesn't appear that this is a very long period of time. The story does not imply that years go by with each of these men before they die. It seems relatively quick. So if that's the case, it does actually make sense that Shelah, being the third son, might actually be just a little young. So if you can imagine, is able to bear children by the time he's 15, 16, 17? So he's probably a little older than Tamar, but he's not old. If he were, say, 17, that maybe puts Onan at 15-ish, maybe Shelah's 13 or 12 himself. If it happens within a couple years, Shelah might actually be essentially prepubescent and not able to bear children yet. And so it could be sensible that Tamar waits, because Shelah may not be old enough just yet. And we're probably not talking about waiting 15 years, but a couple, 3 years maybe. And so it's not that up to now the story seems totally unreasonable. And Onan are bad guys. But Tamar is probably doing what would be reasonably expected of a widow. I do want to note that there is no way around the abuse and mistreatment that she received from Onan. That's a hard story, because if you imagine her word against his, he could have just told people she was barren. And here he is essentially raping her over and over and over again for his own pleasure. So Tamar has been abused at this point, and yet she still seems to be doing the right thing, so to speak, even after having been so badly mistreated. I saw another hand over here.
I was going to ask about the age of Shelah.
Yeah. We don't really know the age of Shelah, but if you think about, maybe a couple years between children, it's very possible that Shelah was just a little too young, and so Judah wasn't maybe in the wrong just yet, but he will be shortly. Other questions? Yes.
So under the law, do the widows have to stay with the husband's family until they basically go through all the brothers?
So under the law, would the widow have to stay with the husband's family until she goes through all the brothers? So the law is really meant to perpetuate the genetic line. And so if you take, it is very odd for us to kind of conceive of this structure. But if you think biologically, it actually makes great sense. Because here is a woman who should have had a child with Ur. Ur dies. And so who is genetically the same as Ur? His brother. And so essentially, what Onan should have had is children with his wife and children with Tamar. That's the way that it's supposed to work. Because then essentially, Tamar's children would have the basic genetics that the children would have had it been Ur and not Onan. So biologically speaking, it is sensible. It also is the way that a woman is cared for. So let me also then say that the levirate marriage law is not only to recognize or remember or respect the deceased husband, it's also to take care of the widow. Because a widow's only real protection is husband or sons. And so that law is really meant not only to kind of create children in the line of the deceased husband, but if you were Tamar, you'd want sons. Because only now that your husband's dead, you really need sons in order to create some security for yourself. And so, as weird as the law sounds, it was, in a sense, trying to do something good or productive, and particularly for the widow herself. This would have created a much more significant sense of security for her in the long run, even though it's a little weird to basically like have your husband's brother get you pregnant. Does that kind of answer your question? She would stay. I mean, really your specific question. If there were a whole bunch of brothers, then technically she'd have to work through all of them, but that's only if they die. Because it's not like, had Onan not died, Sheila would not have come in the picture. Like, it should have only been Onan. But then because Onan died, then it's Sheila. I mean, so theoretically, if a bunch of men died, then yes, you would kind of work your way through all the brothers, but that's so highly unlikely that you would stay within the house. It's unusual that Tamar would have been sent back to her father's house. Not probably wrong, but not common. Typically, Judah would have just kept her in his house until Sheila was old enough. Yes?
As a female, she has no agency to tell Judah what Onan's doing.
No, so the question is, as a woman, would she be able to essentially let people know that Onan's being a jerk? No. If she did, it's her word against his. And she, as you said, she has no agency. Not only is she female, she's also a Canaanite. And so in that sense, she's very much as outside as she can get while still technically being in the family. And so she's not going to have any authority of any kind, which is why ultimately she does what she does, because that's the only real action she has.
I don't think the story says it, but could Onan have been married to another woman?
Could Onan have been married? Yes. It does not say that. And which is why I think it probably makes sense that Onan would have only just been old enough, perhaps to begin to be married himself, which then puts Sheila young enough to have not been able to fulfill the levirate marriage law duty at that moment. So I kind of piece it together that way, that Onan was obviously old enough to bear children, but probably not quite old enough to have already gotten a wife for himself. So you're kind of in that late teen range, is my guess, which then puts Sheila a little preteen. Yes.
So would the fathers have taught any kind of respect for women to their sons, or would it have just been culturally your chaff?
That is a good question. So would the fathers have taught their sons respect for women, kind of theoretically or in principle? In this ancient culture, which is not unlike many cultures around the world, I mean, what I want to say first before we get into this is let us not cast aspersions on ancient cultures in the way that they are or are not moral or ethical based on what we think, because there are plenty of people in our world, in our neighborhood, who are also not upstanding, moral, ethical people. So, in that culture, however, and in cultures around the world today, respect for women, that's not really taught. Respect for your wife is. But here's how that works differently. Women must maintain sexual purity. So a woman is only valuable as a wife if she is a virgin. Men typically, before they get married, are certainly not virgins. And it's actually culturally taught that men are to be experienced before they get married. And so the entire industry of prostitution existed as essentially a training ground for men. This happens around the world still today, where young men are meant to go out and experiment and learn so that then when they get married to a virgin, they know what they're doing. So it's a total double standard. I think that's presumably what is happening here, which is why we later get this story of Judah going and finding a prostitute. And it's like normal, because that's just what men did. Wives would have been respected. And so the person you marry and the mother of your children would then have been protected. And when I say respected, you would very quickly say, well, then you shouldn't go out with a prostitute. Yes, that's how we would say that. But back then it would have been, respect would have been shown as security and protection and food, shelter, all the stuff, all of the ways in which their life would have been safe. It's not as much sexually the way that we would include all of that under one umbrella today. They were kind of separated because really, a good wife was not really good for sexual desire. A good wife was good for children. And so you did not objectify a wife sexually. Men would go fulfill those needs with women who did not need respect. A wife would kind of be held up and not sexualized beyond kind of procreation. Does that make sense? Yeah. Which, my God, I mean, we're all like American from the Puritans. We totally get that. Okay, yes.
Unusual that they're all sons. I mean, they just keep having babies after babies after babies with different wives, and they're all boys. Are there girls born in here that just aren't?
Yes. So, yes, the observation is they seem to only ever bear sons. No, it's just the daughters don't matter. So you don't get many daughters named unless the daughters matter in the story, like, for example, Dinah. So last week you all looked at Dinah, and the idea that Jacob only had 13 children, 12 boys and 1 girl, not a chance. Jacob had more children than that, and certainly more daughters than Dinah, but Dinah had a story. The others didn't really have a story. And of course, the other daughters don't go on to create lines. You know, they are not heads of tribes. They're not material in the arc of the story the way that boys are. And so typically you're only hearing about the people who have some resonance in the story for some purpose. And most of the time daughters don't, unless they then become wives. And then we hear about them as wives, which is part of why I think the study this year is so interesting, is it's so easy to slip back into talking about just the men because the stories are told really about the men. Even when we hear stories of women, it's often only in relationship to the men. And so we've got to kind of dig a little bit and parse out the story in order to make the women's story more three-dimensional. Tamar's not one of those women. She is in control of her story, the way that maybe like Rebecca was. But oftentimes women are only a detail in the man's story, and it's difficult to pull out a lot of her narrative because the storyteller doesn't really emphasize women as much. I have never received that many questions all at once. So this must be interesting to you. Okay, let's keep going. So now we get to the part of the story I particularly like, which is Tamar, her patience is now gone, and she is going to take control of her story. And so she's been waiting dutifully, and she's been dressed as a widow, until one day she hears that Judah is going out to the market, and she kind of pokes around and confirms that Sheila is plenty old enough to have been given to her to fulfill the levirate marriage duty, and yet Judah has not done that. And so in that moment, Tamar has kind of a reckoning. She understands that Judah is not fulfilling his part of this deal. She has no real agency. It's not like she can go sue him to give her Sheila. She can't claim some wrongdoing and think that anyone's going to care about her, a twice widowed Canaanite. And so she essentially does the only thing that she really can do, and that is she sets herself up to deceive Judah into getting her pregnant. We'll talk about that in 1 second, but let's read the story. Chapter 38, verse 12. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah's time of mourning was over, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep," she put off her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. She saw that Sheila was grown up, yet she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He went over to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come into you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?" He answered, "I will send you a kid from the flock." And she said, "Only if you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" And she replied, "Your signet and your cord and the staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went in to her, and she conceived by him. Then she got up and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. When Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adullamite to recover the pledge from the woman, he could not find her. He asked the townspeople, "Where is the temple prostitute who is at Enaim by the wayside?" But they said, "No prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I've not found her." Moreover, the townspeople said, "No prostitute has been here." So Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own. Otherwise, we will be laughed at. You see, I sent this kid, and you could not find her." So let's take some notes on this story real quickly. We're going to start with Judah. So first, Judah is now widowed himself. And yet, I still think the idea of the prostitute is going to not sit well with us. So the big question that I have when I read this is, how did Tamar know this was going to work? I mean, if we think about the story dynamics, Tamar seems to pretty quickly say, "Oh, Judah's going to be on the road. Let me just put a veil over my face and he'll grab me as a prostitute." I mean, if Judah had been a really good guy up to this point, I don't think Tamar would have thought this worked. Judah must have been this kind of person all along for Tamar to think that she could just sit by the side of the road and Judah would see her and say, "Let me come into you." I mean, it's an aggressive story. It's a very it's very rough. And yet Tamar knew for some reason this would work. And so she takes off her widow's garments and she puts on the kind of veil and the covering that a prostitute would wear. This kind of gets at the point made earlier, which is there are two different kinds of women. You've got sort of women who are wives, and you've got women who are prostitutes. And so Tamar essentially puts on the costume of women who are prostitutes. So even if Judah was someone who would seek out the prostitutes, it's important for us to not put our expectations of moral balance on this story. Judah does become important to the story. As noted, it's Judah's descendant who becomes David, who then, becomes Jesus. And in the ancient world, those kinds of prostitutes would actually end up being normative. So a man would not be seen as being some horrible person if he were married and also sought out prostitutes from time to time. It's made better that he is widowed and then seeks out a prostitute. But for our sensibilities, not a lot better. I want us also to note that the storyteller seems to want to make Judah out to be at least some kind of reliable person because he does seek to pay her. And so I know that's a small thing in this whole story, but the storyteller does seem to take pains to say that he gives Tamar his signet cord staff as essentially as a loan before he makes the payment of the goat. And he sends his friend back with the goat, looking to give it to her, and yet she's gone. And so in that sense, Judah does pay when he says he's going to pay, so at least there's that. I don't know. I just want to make sure that we know, Judah's not all bad. Okay, now let's consider Tamar in this story. Tamar puts on the veil, dresses like a prostitute, and she exercises about the only agency she can. Remember, she is a Canaanite. She is widowed twice. She really has no way to get the security she believes she is owed, the justice that she believes the law says that she is owed, except perhaps this way. I want to note that there are a few different kind of marriage laws in the ancient world. The Levirate is one. There are others that do detail out if a brother cannot perform the acts necessary in honor of his dead brother in order for his dead brother's widow to have children, it does fall on the father-in-law to actually have children through his daughter-in-law. Because again, remember, we're talking about biology. And so if you imagine, say for example, there's only one son, and that one son dies and does not have an heir. Biologically speaking, that dead husband's father is at least close genetically to the husband, and so producing an heir essentially replaces the gap of the single dead son. Well, extrapolate that out, and if for some reason the brothers of the dead husband either refuse to perform, or they themselves perhaps are barren or sterile or whatever, or any number of things, like Onan, they're wicked, then actually the father-in-law is supposed to step in. Because again, this is not only for lineage, this is also for security. And so if you were in Tamar's position, as perhaps undesirable as it would be for your father-in-law to get you pregnant, not having children in the long run is way worse. And so you kind of, if we can be frank, you kind of take a moment of gross in order to secure yourself long term. Okay, so Tamar's concept here of her dead husband's father fulfilling what she is owed is not actually outside the bounds of the ancient law. Her method maybe is a little questionable. So what I love about this, though, is that from the jump, Tamar seems to have a plan. And so she's not just showing up to have a child. She's showing up to be vindicated. And the way she does that is she asks for the signet cord and staff. So the signet is the ring that a person would use to kind of seal a document that is totally unique to that person. The cord would just be what the signet is worn. So you imagine you've got this cord like a necklace, and the signet would be the seal that a person would use, and it's like your signature. A staff would also be pretty unique. Not everybody would have the same kind of staff. It's not like people would go out to Target and buy staffs. So instead, that staff would be very special to that person. So having a signet and a staff would identify a single man. And so Tamar does not ask for the signet and staff by accident. She wants something that will very clearly identify Judah. And it's important she has that for what's going to happen in the next part of the story. So with all, is that the only thing I want to say? No, the last thing I want to say about this section of the story, to me perhaps, this story is kind of terrible in many ways all the way through, but perhaps the most heartbreaking thing to me comes at verse 19. Verse 19, the storyteller says, this is after she has met Judah, says, she got up and she went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. There's something about that makes me ache for her, because she is not doing this for pleasure. She's not doing this because she thinks she's going to pull a fast one on Judah. She's doing this out of desperation. There's nothing else that she can do. It's as if she has come to the very final option to give her some kind of security in the future. And the way that verse 19 is written, I see her not triumphant. She's not happy. She doesn't think she has succeeded. In a sense, it's like the worst way she could possibly have to be, and yet she does it because it's the only thing that she can do. And when she takes off that veil and she puts back on the garments of her widowhood, I feel the sadness that she has found herself in this position where that is the only action she can take for her security. It's kind of heartbreaking. Yeah.
Could she not have had security back in her father's house?
No. Women don't have security. So the question is, could she have had security back in her father's house? For a time. Then her father dies. And then what?
What if it was a large family?
That doesn't work that way. So as a widow, you are never secure unless you have children. Now, can you be kind of secure? Sure. So could she have kind of found security with her father? Yes. She would have never been married again. She would have never had children. So had she gone to her father's house, think of Dinah. If you can't actually fulfill your marriage, so don't think of Onan and Judah as just guys that will get her pregnant. These are representatives of her husband. And so if she were to go back to her father's house, there is no one there that can represent her husband. And that she has been twice widowed, she's not getting married again. She's essentially damaged goods. And so she could live in her father's house, sure, and maybe she has some brothers and maybe she could live with them, yes. It is a very low quality of life because the actual quality of life that she's seeking, that really and I believe the storyteller believes she is owed, is having her own children properly so that her children can take care of her. I think that the way the storyteller is telling this story is the righteous and just way for this story to end is Tamar gets children. That is justice because she really has been treated so badly. Not only by as a wicked person, but the way Onan treated her, horrible. and that she has had to go through this deception of Judah to get Judah to do the thing he was supposed to do by law, just reiterates or kind of amplifies the tragedy of her situation. And yet, through all of that tragedy, there is a little opportunity for justice. And I think that's what we're going to see at the end of the story, is that the storyteller really is an arc toward justice. And we'll talk about the way that that resonates over time. Yeah.
Would Sheila have been able to get married to someone else? I mean, you make it sound like culturally it was supposed to.
Would Tamar have been able to get married to someone else?
No. The son, Sheila, when he wasn't given.
Oh, yes, Sheila would have been able to marry someone else. Well, Sheila would have had his own wife. So Onan, a deceased husband's brother would have taken his brother's widow as another wife. He would not need to take his brother's widow as his only wife. So he would have had his own wife. Because remember, if Onan had a child with Tamar, that's Er's child. So Onan would have his own wife and his own children. So he would essentially be he would be the father of two lines, but one line would legally be his, and the other line would legally be his deceased brother's. I know, the legal stuff is complicated, but it needs to be understood, because the people reading the story would have immediately understood all of this. And if we don't, then we miss a lot of the complexity of the story. And we also don't understand what I really want you to understand, which is Tamar gets justice. That's the story. And if we don't know all of the legality around it, it actually looks like Tamar is the deceiver. And it's also easy for us to shame Tamar for her prostitution because it's easy for us to shame prostitutes. And I think that we should take care not to do that thoughtlessly, because Tamar is actually exercising the little bit of agency she has in order to get the justice that the law says she is deserved. Yeah.
I think in some parts of the world even today, widows like that are left big beggars.
Oh, absolutely. Like the comment being, widows are often beggars. I mean, this is not only ancient. This happens in many parts of the world, where if a woman is widowed with no children, that's it, she's done. And the best she can do is beg. And so that's why technically could Tamar go back to her father's house? Yes, but the vulnerability is still very present. And until she has the children, that vulnerability isn't really gone. Okay, so let's press on.
When she went back to her father's house, did she know she couldn't marry again?
Yes.
She knew she was done.
Yeah, so she knew all of those things because that's very common knowledge. So she knew that she wouldn't get married in her father's house. So she was patient, waiting for Sheila. Sheila never came. So she took control. And so now she has gone back to wait for Sheila. Because remember, in the story, Judah still thinks Tamar's over there waiting for Sheila, and Judah has no intention of sending Sheila to Tamar. So after she goes back, everyone learns that she is pregnant. So let's do the final section today, which is Tamar's pregnancy. So she returns home, she puts back on her widow's garments, and yet, obviously, when one is pregnant, you can't hide it forever. And so as the story goes, 3 months later, people learn she's pregnant. Judah learns she's pregnant. I mean, can you just imagine kind of the rumor mill? Because here Tamar has spent years widowed in her garments at her father's house, and yet, poof, she's pregnant. And so now everyone's saying Tamar did wrong. And so if we look at verse 24, we see that the rumors begin to swirl. About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the whore. Moreover, she is pregnant as a result of whoredom." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." At this point, Tamar's 3 months pregnant. People have been talking about it. Judah's response here is brutal. burning. Can you remember someone burned in the Bible? I mean, burning was very exceptional. Being burned alive was so exceptional. I mean, it was withheld for the very, very worst. Here, Judah's response to Tamar's pregnancy is burn her. I think what is happening here for Judah is he finally sees an out. He's been waiting and keeping Shelah from Tamar because he is somehow convinced himself that Tamar is the bad one killing his sons. Tamar gets pregnant, and he sees his chance to get her out of the picture so that she can't kill his third son. And so look at verse 25. As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "It was the owner of these who made me pregnant." And she said, "Take note, please, whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." Then Judah acknowledged them and said, "She is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not lie with her again. So Judah needed to believe Tamar was bad in order to justify not fulfilling the law as it was written. As they go and drag Tamar out of her house, she fulfills the plan she made before she ever went to the side of that road. She takes the signet and the cord and the staff, and she says, "The person who owns these got me pregnant." And of course, Judah can't deny them. And so Judah then realizes that she has actually been in the right. And he claims it. And he understands that he has been the one doing wrong. Now, here is why I told you the story of Joseph first. In chapter 37, verse 31, it says, "They took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They had the long robe with sleeves taken to their father, and they said, 'This we have found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not.'" In Hebrew, "see now" is hakar na. Essentially, it says, look at this, claim this, tell us if this is what you recognize, hakar na. That same phrase is used in chapter 38:25, when Tamar says to Judah, "Take note." That is hakar na. And so what the storyteller is actually telling us is what Judah did to Joseph has now come full circle back against him. And so not only has Tamar been the one in the right this whole time, but Judah's mistake has now come back to hurt him in his relationship with Tamar. And that kind of literary connection, I find delicious. It's so good that Judah did wrong and he got it in the end. I love it. Judah identifies these items and he is so busted. And so Tamar is discovered to be righteous. She has secured justice for herself. And Judah actually says that Tamar is, in Hebrew, tzedakah. And tzedakah is a righteous person who is upstanding. And so Judah names her this particular kind of righteousness that is owned by yourself. So this is not something that others do for you, not something others put on you. This is something you own yourself. You have made a choice to live a life that is upstanding and righteous, and that is tzedakah. And so Judah names Tamar that way. So Tamar ultimately gives birth. She gives birth to twin boys, and those twin boys are Perez and Zerah. And why this matters in the story is because when you look at the very first verses of the New Testament, you see that the first woman named in the New Testament is Tamar. Matthew chapter 1 says, an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. What is amazing is that women are never included in genealogies. And yet the first woman included in the genealogy of Jesus is a Canaanite woman who prostitutes herself to her father-in-law in order to fulfill the righteousness that she deserves. It is a stunning inclusion because what the gospel writers want us to know is that God's purposes can be fulfilled by every person. Nobody is excluded. Not a foreigner, not a widow, not a prostitute. Not anyone who seeks to fulfill the righteousness that God promises to them. And even Tamar, in everything that she did, is one that God uses to fulfill the greatest purpose of all. That's the message for us in the story of Tamar, is that no matter what we've done, no matter what other people think about us, when we pursue God's righteousness, when we understand our strength, our responsibility, and we own that tzedakah, when we understand that justice is for God, and that no matter what has happened in our lives, we can still seek after that justice, we actually are the ones who become part of God's great purpose. And that should be the hopeful message that Tamar gives us. And so thanks for being here. We'll do more next week.